The night Knox Mercer found the boy, the mountain was trying to kill them both. Wind came off the Blue Ridge like something with teeth. Temperature had dropped 17 degrees in under an hour, and the road ahead had disappeared completely into white. Knox had ridden through worse, through firefights, through grief, through 15 years of burying things that refused to stay buried, but this blizzard felt different, personal. Like the mountain had decided tonight was the night to settle something. He almost didn't stop, almost kept going, head down, throttle steady, the way he'd been living since the day Grant Hale walked out and took Knox's faith in people with him. Almost. But something under the snow moved. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like the coldest place in the world was inside your own chest, this story was written for you. Subscribe to the channel and follow every part to the end, because what happens next will break you open in the best way. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's ride. The blizzard had been building since noon. By 3 in the afternoon, every sensible driver in Harlan County had pulled off Route 9 and was waiting it out in gas station parking lots with the engine running and the heat cranked high. Weather radio called it a historic event. Meteorologists with studio haircuts and dry blazers used words like unprecedented and dangerous conditions with the calm authority of people who would never have to drive through it. Knox Mercer was not a sensible driver. He'd left Asheville before the storm hit critical, because he'd learned a long time ago that waiting for conditions to improve was just another way of lying to yourself. Conditions didn't improve. You either moved through them, or they moved through you. He'd been riding since he was 17, hauling himself across 43 states on a succession of machines that got louder and heavier as he got older, and he'd developed the particular relationship with weather that soldiers develop with incoming fire, a respect that had nothing to do with comfort. The Harley was a 2009 Road King, matte black, stripped of anything decorative, no chrome accents, no fringe. The only thing on it that wasn't functional was the patch on his left saddlebag, a small iron-on of a mountain silhouette that one of the prospects had put there 3 years ago as a joke and which Knox had never removed. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't a man who examined his reasons for things. He was 41 years old, and he rode like someone who expected the road to hurt him. The wind hit 60 miles an hour as he crested the last ridge before the mountain clubhouse, and for a moment the bike went sideways beneath him, rear tire skating, chassis torquing, and Knox felt the old familiar conversation between his hands and the machine, the silent negotiation that happened in the nervous system faster than thought. He corrected. The bike found its line again. His heartbeat didn't change. What changed was the visibility. The headlight punched maybe 8 feet into the white and then dissolved into nothing. Knox dropped to 15 miles an hour, then 10. The guardrail to his right was a suggestion, a gray smear at the edge of vision. Below it, he knew, was a 400-foot drop into a creek bed that would be frozen solid by now. He knew this road the way he knew his own hands, had ridden it in darkness and rain, and once in a fugue state after Tucson that he didn't like to think about. But whiteout was different from darkness. Whiteout was its own category of blind. He was thinking about the guardrail, specifically about the section around mile marker 11, where it had buckled during a logging truck incident 2 summers back, and the county had replaced it with something that looked structurally optimistic at best, when his headlight caught a shape. It was the wrong shape for the roadside. Too rounded. Too low to the ground to be a deer, too large to be debris. It was the shape of something that had stopped where stopping wasn't supposed to happen. Knox braked slowly, felt the front wheel shimmy on ice, and brought the bike to a stop 20 feet from the shape. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, exhaust plume whipping sideways in the wind. The shape didn't move. He killed the engine. The silence that came in was enormous. He unstrapped his helmet and set it on the gas tank, because he needed his hearing as much as his eyes, and the helmet muffled both. Cold hit his face like something thrown. He climbed off the bike, boots finding uneven purchase on ice-covered asphalt, and walked toward the shape in the snow. It was a child. The kid was curled into himself, fetal position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around his own torso. He was wearing a blue winter coat that was about 40% adequate for these conditions. No hat, one glove. The exposed side of his face had that particular gray-white color that Knox recognized from the one winter he'd spent in Kandahar. a color that meant the body was making terrible decisions about what to keep warm and what to let go. Knox dropped to his knees in the snow. "Hey!" His voice came out rougher than he intended, always did. "Hey, kid, open your eyes." Nothing. He pulled off his glove with his teeth and pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck below the jaw. Pulse was there. Weak and slow, but there. The boy's lips had a bluish cast. His eyelashes were frosted. Knox had done 2 combat tours, one in Afghanistan and one in a country he still couldn't talk about in legal terms, and he had a working familiarity with crisis. The particular quality of attention that descended on him in those moments was not calm exactly. It was something sharper than calm, a kind of furious clarity in which everything irrelevant burned away and what remained was pure sequence. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. Step 1, stop the heat loss. He unzipped his leather jacket, the club cut, 12 years of patches and weather and mileage, and wrapped it around the boy, tucking it under him on both sides. The cold hit Knox's chest through his flannel like a deliberate insult. He ignored it. Step 2, assess movement. He slid his arms beneath the child, one under the knees and one under the shoulders, and lifted. The boy was light in the way malnourishment was light. Not the clean lightness of a small body, but something more like vacancy. Knox stood carefully, redistributing his weight, testing the ice beneath his boots. Step 3, get to shelter. The clubhouse was 1.5 miles up the mountain. He could not ride and hold the boy. He could not leave the boy and go for help. By the time he returned, the equation would have a different outcome. Knox looked at his bike once, thought about what it would cost to leave it on the roadside in a blizzard. The customizations, the years, the specific way it ran that no shop had ever quite managed to replicate after the incident in Cheyenne. Then he turned away from it and started walking. The mountain didn't care about his bike either. The 1.5 miles took 40 minutes. Knox's flannel was soaked through inside 10 and his core temperature was dropping by the time he hit the first quarter-mile marker. But he'd learned something in the military that civilians mostly hadn't. That the body would keep going long past the point where the mind declared it finished, and that the trick was to stop listening to the mind and start listening to the mission. The mission was the weight in his arms. The boy made sounds occasionally, small, unconscious sounds, the kind that weren't words yet, but were pushing toward them. Knox kept talking, low and steady, the way he'd learned to talk to a scared horse once when he was 17 on a farm outside Knoxville, a long time before any of the other things that had happened. "You're okay," he said. "I got you. You're okay." He said it enough times that it stopped being a description and started being a decision. The clubhouse came out of the white slowly. First the orange glow of the windows, then the dark bulk of the building, then the 2 bikes parked under the overhang with fresh snow accumulation on the seats. Knox kicked the door with the toe of his boot 3 times, because his hands were occupied, and he had made a policy of not asking the mountain for anything. The door opened. Decker stood there, 6'4", 260 pounds, a beard that had become its own jurisdiction, wearing a thermal shirt with the sleeves torn off in apparent defiance of the season. He took in Knox, the snow coating Knox's shoulders, the boy in Knox's arms, and the fact that Knox was shaking badly enough to see from a distance. "Hell," Decker said. "Move," Knox said. Decker moved. The clubhouse interior was the accumulated geography of 15 years, a place that had been a hunting lodge before Decker's old man bought it, then a party spot, then slowly, grudgingly, something closer to a home. The central room had a stone fireplace large enough to park a small car in, currently roaring with what looked like a recent and serious investment of wood, mismatched furniture, a bar that nobody had used as a bar in 3 years since Rooster got sober and made it weird. Photographs on the walls, some of them framed, most of them not. There were 6 men in the room. By the time Knox had taken 4 steps inside, all 6 were on their feet. The transformation was not dramatic. There were no speeches and no orders given. It was more like a temperature change, the specific shift that happened in this particular group of men when something real was required of them. Chairs scraped back. Rooster went for the radio on the shelf. Mackie disappeared into the back and came out 30 seconds later with dry towels and the first aid kit. Decker had the boy's coat off before Knox had fully processed setting him down. "He's been out there a while," Knox said. "How long?" Mackie asked. "No way to know." Decker pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. Did the same math Knox had done on the roadside. His face didn't change, which in Decker's case was either a good sign or a terrible one. "Fireplace," Decker said. "Not too close. You want gradual warming, not shock." Nobody questioned how Decker knew this. Decker knew a lot of things that nobody had asked him to explain. They moved the boy to the rug in front of the fire, keeping a careful 3 feet of distance between him and the flames. Mackie layered dry blankets. Rooster got on the radio trying to raise emergency services and immediately encountered the structural problem, which was that the storm had taken the tower on Miller's Ridge, and the county was operating on backup systems that weren't reaching this far into the mountains. "Best estimate on roads?" Knox asked. Rooster shook his head. "Morning. Maybe longer." Knox was still shaking. He pulled a chair close to the boy and sat in it and put his hands on his knees and worked on stopping the shaking with the focused attention he'd once applied to field stripping a rifle in the dark. The boy's color started changing after about 20 minutes. The gray-white lightened incrementally. His breathing deepened. Decker had his temperature every few minutes with the kit's thermometer, calling out the numbers in a low voice. And the numbers were moving in the right direction. It was during the 4th temperature check that the boy opened his eyes. They were brown, large, the kind of eyes that had been doing a lot of work lately, the kind that had learned too early to watch for things other kids weren't watching for. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the fire, then slowly at the ring of large and weather-worn men surrounding him with an attention that was careful but not gentle. Exactly. More like the attention of people who understood that certain things required precision. His lips moved. Knox leaned in. "Say it again." The boy's voice was barely there, a thread of sound pulled thin by cold and exhaustion. But the words were distinct. "Don't fight." The room was quiet for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with the blizzard. Knox straightened up slowly. He looked at the boy's face, the bone structure, the specific architecture of the jaw, the way the brow came down in the middle. He told himself he wasn't looking for anything. Told himself that as a specific, deliberate act, the way you tell yourself not to look at something that is already pulling all of your attention. Then Mackie started removing the boy's frozen outer layers, working carefully, and the locket fell out. It hit the wood floor with a sound entirely too loud for its size. A small silver oval on a thin chain, the kind of thing you could buy at any pawn shop for $12. The kind of thing that had no business carrying the weight it apparently carried, because Knox Mercer's hand stopped moving and something behind his eyes went very still. He picked up the locket. He opened it. The photograph inside was small and creased from what looked like years of handling. 2 men in their mid-20s, one grinning, one not. The grinning one was Knox, younger by 15 years, 20 pounds lighter, with both his illusions still intact. The one not grinning but smiling in that specific way that meant something more than grinning. That was Grant Hale. Grant Hale, who had been Knox's best friend since they were 19 years old and sharing a barracks room in Fort Bragg. Grant Hale, who had stood up for Knox at a military hearing and then disappeared 2 months later without explanation or warning. Grant Hale, whose absence had left a specific shape in Knox's life, like a load-bearing wall removed, not immediately catastrophic, but fundamentally altering the structure of everything above it. Knox sat with the locket in his hand for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the blizzard pushed against the windows with a sound like something trying to get in. The boy had drifted back towards sleep, his breathing even now, the color in his face approaching something viable. Decker appeared at Knox's elbow, looked at the locket, looked at Knox's face. "What?" Decker said. Knox didn't answer immediately. He was doing the arithmetics. The boy's age, the photograph, the particular architecture of a jaw he recognized. He closed the locket. "The kid's name," Knox said quietly. "What do we know about the kid?" Nobody knew anything yet. There'd been no identification in the coat pockets, no bag, nothing in the frozen gloves. The boy was a child who had appeared on a mountain road in a blizzard, carrying nothing but cold and a locket belonging to a man Knox had spent 15 years trying to stop thinking about. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Inside, something was getting started. Knox set the locket on the arm of his chair and looked at the sleeping boy and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific weight of a question he didn't have the answer to. One of those questions that arrives not as curiosity, but as a kind of dread, because some part of you already suspects what the answer is going to cost. The boy slept, the fire burned, the storm pressed in, and in the silence between all of it, Knox Mercer sat with a dead man's locket in his hand and wondered what else was buried in the snow waiting to be found. The locket sat on the arm of the chair all night like an accusation. Knox didn't sleep. He sat in the same position he'd taken when the boy drifted off, elbows on knees, hands loose between them, and watched the fire work its way through the wood Decker kept adding in slow, methodical intervals. The storm outside had reached a register beyond sound. It had become a presence, something that pressed against the walls of the clubhouse with the patient insistence of something that intended to outlast them all. The windows had stopped being windows. They were just bright rectangles of white noise. The other men slept in shifts, the way men do who have learned that rest is a tactical decision rather than a comfort. Decker took the first watch without being asked. Rooster took the second. Mackie fell asleep sitting up in the armchair by the hall, and nobody woke him because Mackie had been driving 300 miles a week for the past month, dealing with his mother's estate, and the kind of exhaustion that settled into him had moved past the cosmetic and into the structural. Knox watched the boy breathe. He'd been doing it for hours now, this watching, not with the clinical attention of someone monitoring vital signs, though he was doing that too, marking the slow deepening of the boy's color, the gradual easing of the tension in the small jaw. He was doing it with something else, something he didn't have a clean word for, which meant it was probably one of the things he'd spent 15 years building walls around. Owen. He'd gotten the name during the second hour, when the boy had surfaced briefly from the half-sleep of the severely cold, long enough to answer 3 questions in the flat, exhausted tone of a child who had learned to answer questions the way adults wanted them answered. His name was Owen. He was 6. He didn't know the name of the road. He'd said nothing else before going under again. Knox turned the locket over in his hand. He'd been doing this intermittently, picking it up, turning it, setting it down. The metal had long since lost the warmth of his palm and sat cold against his fingers each time, which felt appropriate. He'd opened it 4 times, looked at the photograph 4 times, put it away 4 times, as if looking at it enough might change what it showed, or change what it meant that he was sitting in a mountain clubhouse in a blizzard holding evidence that Grant Hale had kept a photograph of the 2 of them long past the point where Knox had stopped believing Grant Hale thought about him at all. 15 years. That was the number that sat in his chest like a stone. 15 years since the day Knox had waited at the bar on Clement Street in San Francisco where they'd agreed to meet, the bar that smelled like old wood and worse decisions. And Grant hadn't come, hadn't called, hadn't sent word through any of the mutual channels that still existed in those days before everything fractured into separate lives. Knox had waited 3 hours and 40 minutes. He knew the exact figure because he'd looked at his watch with increasing precision as the evening dissolved. And then he'd paid his tab and walked out and told himself a story about what kind of man Grant Hale was. He'd been telling that story ever since. The story had the virtue of explaining things. That was the main thing stories did when you needed them. They explained the unexplainable in terms that let you keep functioning. The story Knox had told himself was about betrayal, about a friendship that had been transactional from Grant's side, even when it hadn't been from his, about the fundamental loneliness of trusting people who weren't built for the weight of being trusted. It was a functional story. It had served him adequately for 15 years. The photograph in the locket was a problem for the story. You didn't keep a photograph of someone in a locket that your 6-year-old son wore around his neck if they were someone you'd used and discarded. That wasn't the math of it. Knox understood enough about human behavior, had spent enough time watching the architecture of how people carried their damage, to know that you kept something close to a child's skin because it mattered in a way that outlasted the circumstances. Because you wanted the child to know that person existed, even if existing and being present were different things. Grant had wanted Owen to know Knox existed. Knox sat with that for a long time. Around 4 in the morning, Owen made a sound and Knox was out of his chair before he'd consciously decided to move. An old reflex, the kind that came from years of sleeping light in places where sounds had consequences. He crouched beside the boy, one hand hovering over the blanketed shoulder without quite touching. Owen's eyes opened. Not the slow surfacing of earlier. These eyes opened with intention, with someone behind them. He looked at Knox for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read on an adult face and nearly impossible on a child's. A species of careful assessment, a measuring. Then something in the small face settled. "You're still here," Owen said. His voice was rough with cold and sleep, but it was there, fully present, clear. "Yeah," Knox said. "I thought you left." "I don't leave kids on mountain roads in blizzards." "You left your motorcycle," Owen said, and the observation was so precise and delivered with such unnerving calm that Knox had to reassess his estimate of what 6 years old contained. "Motorcycle's fine," Knox said. "Motorcycles don't freeze." Owen considered this with apparent seriousness. He looked at the fire. He looked at the ceiling, tracking something that wasn't there. He looked back at Knox. "Are you the bad guys?" he asked. And there it was, the question that every single man in that room had been asked in one form or another by someone who mattered to them. The question that sat at the center of what it meant to wear a patch and live outside the comfortable middle of things. Knox had answered it different ways at different points in his life. He'd answered it with defiance and with irony, and once, memorably, with a list of specific incidents that he still stood behind. He'd never quite answered it the way he answered it now. "We're the guys who found you," he said. "That's all we are tonight." Owen seemed to accept this as a sufficient working definition. The questions that followed came in the careful, nonlinear way that children ask things, not building logically toward anything, but circling around whatever was actually occupying the center of the boy's mind, approaching it from different angles the way you'd approach something you weren't sure was safe. He asked about the motorcycles outside. He asked if the big man was Knox's father. He asked whether Knox had ever seen a coyote. He asked whether the fire would last until morning. Knox answered everything straight. He'd learned a long time ago that children processed information differently than adults. They were less interested in tone, in the performance of reassurance, and more interested in the actual content of what you said, the literal information. He gave Owen the literal information. The motorcycles were Harleys, 2 Road Kings, and a Dyna. The big man was Decker, and he was Knox's brother in the specific way that didn't require blood. He'd seen a coyote once in New Mexico. The fire would last. Then Owen said, in the same conversational tone he'd used for coyotes, "My dad has a picture of you." The fire cracked. Outside, wind moved something heavy across the roof and set it rolling. Decker, half asleep in the armchair across the room, didn't stir. Knox stayed very still. "Does he?" In his wallet, a really old one. "You're both younger." Owen paused. "You look happier in the old one." Knox turned the locket over in his hand. He hadn't been aware he'd picked it up again. "Where's your dad now, Owen?" The boy's expression changed, not dramatically. A child with Owen's particular quality of carefulness didn't do dramatic, but something moved behind the eyes, a small shuddering, a drawing inward. "Home," Owen said. "Where's home?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell Knox that home was a complicated word. "Crestview," Owen said finally. "It's a town. There's a gas station and a library and a school. The school is okay. And you're up on this mountain because they were fighting again." Owen said it matter-of-factly. The way you state a thing you've stated so many times, it's lost its shock value and retained only its weight. "They fight a lot, Mom and Dad. It's really loud." A beat. "I thought if I walked far enough away, it would get quiet." Knox looked at the 6-year-old boy who had walked into a blizzard looking for quiet and felt something move through his chest that he couldn't entirely contain and didn't try to. "Did it?" he asked. Owen looked around the clubhouse, the fireplace, the sleeping men, the dark corners full of accumulated years. He looked at Knox. "Yeah," he said. "It did." By the time Decker took over so Knox could eat something and get his core temperature back to operational levels, Knox had been sitting with Owen for 2 hours. 2 hours of the boy talking and Knox listening in the particular way he listened, which was without interruption and without the nervous gap filling that most people deployed when silence appeared. The result was that Owen had told him, in pieces and without apparent awareness of the larger picture he was assembling, the outline of a life. The outline contained a custody arrangement that was 3 months old and apparently adversarial. It contained a mother named Claire who cried at night when she thought Owen was asleep. It contained a father who had started a business and lost it, who had moved back to Crestview from somewhere else. Owen didn't name the somewhere else, but described it as far away and flat, and who spent a lot of time looking at his phone with an expression Owen described as the same face he makes when something is broken and he doesn't have the part. It contained a silver locket that Grant Hale had apparently worn himself until recently, when he'd transferred it to Owen with an instruction that Owen repeated to Knox with careful fidelity. If you ever get really scared, this is proof that there are good people in the world. There was a man who was my brother once, and he was the best man I ever knew. Knox ate his food without tasting it. The morning came in stages, the way it does after a bad night. First a general lightening of the windows, then a thinning of the blizzard sound, then actual gray light making its first tentative case for itself against the white. By 7, the wind had dropped to something that was merely hostile rather than homicidal. By 8, Rooster's radio was picking up county emergency services intermittently. By 9, there were tire tracks in the new snow leading up to the clubhouse. Knox heard the vehicles before he saw them. 2 of them. The specific sound of county vehicles, the slightly labored quality of engines doing mountain roads in adverse conditions. He was at the window before the first one came into view, and he registered the light bar on the roof of the first vehicle with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that were going to be complicated. "Company," he said. The word moved through the room with its own energy, the particular energy of a group of men who had variable and complicated histories with county vehicles, and the people who drove them. Nobody panicked. This was not a group that panicked, but postures shifted, and the specific alert stillness that Knox associated with the first moments of a situation moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Decker appeared at Knox's shoulder, looked at the vehicles, looked at Knox. "You called them?" Decker asked. "Rooster raised them on the radio 2 hours ago." "And you didn't mention this." "I'm mentioning it now." Decker made a sound that was not a word but communicated a complete sentence. The county vehicles pulled up to the clubhouse in a way that attempted to be authoritative and was somewhat undermined by the 6 inches of fresh snow they had to navigate. 2 sheriff's deputies and a woman in a county child services jacket got out, all 3 moving with that specific posture of people who were entering a situation they'd already decided about before they arrived. Knox opened the door before they knocked. The deputy in front, late 30s, the kind of face that ran toward default suspicion and had been running that direction for long enough that it had settled permanently, looked at Knox, looked at the clubhouse behind him, looked at the Iron Covenant patches on the vests of the 2 men visible inside. His expression did the math and arrived at a conclusion. "You the ones that called it in?" "We are," Knox said. "The child's inside?" "He is. He's warm. He's been talking for the past 2 hours. Temperature's been stable for the last 3. Knox stepped back from the door to let them in. "He fell asleep about 40 minutes ago. I'd appreciate it if you let him stay that way for another few minutes." The deputy didn't move immediately. He was doing the version of the assessment that people in his position did. The square footage of threat calculation, the tactical geometry of 6 large men in a room full of motorcycling memorabilia and firearm-shaped shadows. "How'd you find him?" the deputy asked. "Riding up Route 9. He was in the snow near mile marker 11. "Alone?" "If he'd had company, they weren't visible," Knox said. The deputy stepped inside. The child services woman. Her name tag said Elaine Cortez, and she had the particular exhausted competence of someone who'd been doing hard work for a long time and had made her peace with the fact that it would never be done. Went immediately to Owen, crouched beside him with the practiced ease of someone who spent a lot of time at child height, and began her assessment. The second deputy stayed near the door in a way that was meant to be casual and was not. Knox stood in the center of the room and let it happen. This was one of the specific disciplines he'd developed over the years. The ability to stand in a situation that was making all his instincts loud, and to be still anyway. The instincts were saying a number of things simultaneously. They were saying that the deputy's hand was too close to his holster for a situation that was manifestly not threatening. They were saying that Elaine Cortez's manner with Owen, while professionally competent, contained an undertow of institutional procedure that was already beginning to treat the boy as a case file rather than a child. They were saying that the fastest way to make this situation worse was to let any of that show. He kept his hands visible and his voice flat and answered questions for the next 40 minutes. The questions were procedural at first, the sequence of events, the medical interventions, the names of everyone present. Knox answered them all directly, including the names, because he'd made a policy decision years ago that the worst way to deal with authority was to make yourself look like you had something to hide, even when you had things you'd rather not discuss. Decker answered his questions with a monosyllabic precision that bordered on art. Rooster, to no one's surprise, was the most forthcoming. Rooster had a gift for talking to officials that the rest of them had long since stopped resenting and started being grateful for. Then Owen woke up. The room's whole dynamic shifted in the way a room's dynamic shifts when a child becomes conscious and starts reading it. Owen came awake with the same intentional clarity he'd shown at 4 a.m, sat up in his blankets, looked around, and found Knox's position in the room with an accuracy that was not accidental. Elaine Cortez was beside him immediately. "Hey, sweetheart, my name is Elaine. I work for the county. You're safe." Owen looked at her, looked at Knox, back at her. "I know I'm safe," Owen said. The deputy near the door wrote something in his notebook. The questions to Owen were careful and gently inflected and covered the same territory Knox's conversation had covered at 4 a.m, but with the addition of several questions about the men in the room. Whether Owen was scared of them, whether anyone had touched him in a way that made him uncomfortable, whether he felt free to say what he wanted. Owen answered each one with a patient literalness that Knox recognized because it was the same quality he'd been responding to all night. He wasn't scared of them. Nobody had touched him except to warm him up, and that was fine because he'd been really cold. He said what he wanted. He wanted to stay. That last one landed in the room like a stone. Elaine Cortez's expression shifted. Professionally neutral, but something underneath it moved. She'd heard that before, Knox suspected. She'd heard it in various configurations and under various circumstances, and she'd developed the practitioner's relationship with it. The understanding that what a child wanted and what was procedurally correct were sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. "Owen," she said gently, "we need to get you somewhere with your family." "My family fights," Owen said. A beat of silence. "We're going to help with that," Elaine said. "Okay." Owen looked at Knox again. The look contained a question that didn't have words yet. The kind of question that forms in a child before language has caught up to the shape of what they're afraid of. "Is he coming?" "Mr. Elaine checked her notes. "Mr. Mercer isn't your family, Owen." "He found me," Owen said. "He did, and that was very—" "He stayed all night." Owen's voice didn't rise. It just became more precise, the way a small voice becomes more precise when it's carrying more weight than it was designed for. "He talked to me, and he stayed, and he didn't leave. That's what family does. My mom says that's what family does." The deputy by the door stopped writing. Knox looked at the floor, looked at the fire, looked at the locket on the arm of his chair. He thought about a bar on Clement Street. 3 hours and 40 minutes. The specific quality of the air when he'd finally paid his tab and walked out. The cold of the San Francisco night. The decision he'd made on the sidewalk that he was going to stop waiting for people to show up. He'd been executing that decision ever since. It had taken him to Montana and New Mexico, and eventually to these mountains, through the club and through a series of arrangements with people that were satisfying in specific ways and insufficient in the way that mattered. He'd been executing it so thoroughly and for so long that he'd started to mistake it for a personality trait rather than a wound. He picked up the locket. He walked across the room and crouched down in front of Owen, at child height, in the small, clear space that Elaine Cortez made for him with a professionalism that he recognized as deliberate and was grateful for. "I'll find you," Knox said. Owen looked at him. "Promise?" Knox had a strict policy about promises. He'd developed it in the military and refined it in the years since. Never make them unless you intended to keep them and could see the realistic mechanism by which keeping them was possible. He looked at the 6-year-old boy with Grant Hale's jaw and a locket full of a friendship that had survived 15 years of silence in someone's memory, if not in his own. "Yeah," he said. "Promise." He put the locket in Owen's hand. The boy's fingers closed around it. They took Owen 20 minutes later. It was professional and not unkind. Elaine Cortez knew her job, and she did it with a competence that kept the edges blunt. But it was still the specific experience of watching something necessary happen that you couldn't influence beyond the edges, and it worked on Knox in ways he was choosing not to examine while the county vehicles were still in visual range. Owen went quietly, with the dignity of a child who had learned to do what adults required of him while reserving judgment. But at the door of the vehicle, he turned, and for just a second the carefully maintained composure of a 6-year-old who'd been managing adult chaos for longer than 6-year-olds should have fractured, and he looked at Knox with all of it showing. The fear, the exhaustion, the specific terror of being put back into a situation that had already once driven him into a blizzard, and said, "Please don't let them take me." Knox stood in the doorway of the clubhouse with cold air hitting his chest and his hands at his sides, and watched the vehicle door close. Watched both vehicles navigate the snow back to the road. Watched them disappear into the pines. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. Decker appeared beside him. They stood together looking at the empty snow where the vehicles had been. "You going after him?" Decker said. It was not a question. "Yes," Knox said. Decker was quiet for a moment. "The father. You know him." "Yeah." "How?" Knox turned the locket, which was not in his hand. Owen had it now, had taken it with him in the vehicle, over between his fingers, out of habit, and felt the phantom weight of it, the specific negative space of something that had been present and now wasn't. "He was the best man I ever knew," Knox said. Decker absorbed this. He had the great gift, Decker, of being able to absorb things without requiring them to be explained further than they needed to be. It was one of the reasons Knox had stayed in one place long enough to call it home. "And then?" Decker asked. "And then he wasn't there." Another silence. The pines at the edge of the property held 3 inches of new snow on every horizontal surface. The sky was doing something tentative toward clearing, a thin wash of lighter gray appearing at the eastern edge of the cloud cover. "You going to be able to handle this?" Decker asked. Not with doubt in it. As a genuine inquiry, the kind that one man makes of another when he's deciding how much backup to pack. Knox looked at the road where the vehicles had gone. He thought about Owen's face at the car door. He thought about a locket carried 15 years by a man who apparently hadn't been able to let go of something Knox had let go of out of self-preservation and called principle. He thought about the specific feeling of carrying a child through a blizzard with cold, eating through his flannel, and deciding that the mission was the weight in his arms. He thought about 15 years of a story that might have been wrong from the beginning. "I don't know," Knox said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in a long time. He went inside to find his keys. Rooster was at the bar that wasn't a bar anymore, with a cup of coffee and his phone out, pulling up county child services information with the focused efficiency of a man who'd spent a lot of years finding information that other people hadn't made easy to find. He slid the phone across the counter without being asked. Knox looked at it. Crestview Family Services. The address was 40 minutes down the mountain in clear conditions, which meant an hour or better on roads that were going to be somewhere between bad and a genuine problem. "Road conditions?" Knox asked. "County's running a plow on the main route. You'll get through." Rooster paused. "The secondary roads into Crestview are going to be rough." "I've been on rough roads." "Knox." Rooster said his name with a specific inflection. Not cautionary, not parental. The way of a man who'd known him long enough to say his name and have it carry information. "You okay?" "Ask me in 3 hours." He was at the door when Mackie said, from the armchair where he had apparently been awake for the past 20 minutes, listening with his eyes closed, "You want company?" Knox stopped. He considered the question, which contained more than itself. It contained the particular topology of what the club was, which was not a gang, And not a family exactly, and not a military unit, but something built from the residue of all three. A collection of damaged men who'd agreed to show up for each other because showing up was the thing they could still do when other things had stopped being possible. "No," Knox said. "This one I do alone." He stepped out into the cold. His bike was still where he'd left it the night before, under the overhang with snow on the seat. He cleared the seat, checked the engine temperature, cold-soaked after hours in the blizzard, which meant a longer warm-up than he liked, and sat on it and waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. The engine caught on the third try. The sound of it in the cold morning air was specific, that particular rough idle that would smooth out once the oil got moving, the sound that Knox's nervous system had learned over a decade to receive as something adjacent to comfort. He sat with it idling and looked at the mountain road and thought about what he was riding toward. He was riding toward Grant Hale, who had been his brother and then his wound and then his cautionary tale. He was riding toward a 6-year-old boy who had walked into a blizzard looking for quiet and found something else instead. He was riding toward the specific moment when a 15-year story would have to be tested against whatever the actual truth turned out to be, and he was fully aware that the truth had a way of being more complicated than the stories built to contain it. He'd made a promise. He didn't make them lightly, and he didn't break them. Knox Mercer put the bike in gear. He was 200 yards down the mountain road, the cold hitting his face and the engine warming under him and the pines on both sides holding their new snow in the particular stillness of a landscape just after a storm when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He didn't stop. He'd check it when he got to Crestview. But he knew, with the specific knowledge of a man who'd spent 15 years cultivating the ability to ignore what was pushing at the edges of his certainty, that whatever that message said was going to change something about what happened next. Because that was how the universe operated when you'd finally stopped lying to yourself about a thing. It handed you the next piece, and the next piece was never the one you'd prepared for. The road wound down through the pines, and Knox rode it, and behind him the clubhouse disappeared into the trees, and ahead of him, 40 minutes and 15 years away, a man named Grant Hale was about to find out that the storm had not been finished with either of them yet. The phone buzzed again. This time Knox pulled over, one boot on the ice, and looked at the screen. The number was local. The message was 3 words, sent from what appeared to be the County Child Services Center, from a contact identified only by a Crestview area code and a name Knox had not seen on any screen for 15 years. 3 words. "I know you're coming." Knox stared at the message for a long time in the cold mountain morning, exhaust curling white from the pipe behind him, the pines perfectly still on both sides, the cleared road ahead running down toward whatever came next. Grant Hale wasn't running. Grant Hale was waiting. And Knox Mercer, who had spent 15 years being a man who didn't need answers, felt the last clean line of the story he'd been living dissolve completely, and underneath it, raw and undefended and exactly as dangerous as he'd always known it would be if he let it surface, was the thing he'd been carrying since the night on Clement Street when he'd paid his tab and walked out and told himself he was done. He wasn't done. He'd never been done. He put the phone in his pocket, put both boots back on the pegs, and rode. The Crestview Family Services Building was a single-story structure on the edge of town that had been built in the optimistic architectural language of the early 90s and had been slowly losing that argument with the weather ever since. Aluminum siding the color of old teeth. A parking lot with 3 vehicles in it, one of them the county SUV that Knox had watched carry Owen down the mountain 40 minutes ago. A flagpole with a flag that the morning wind was working on with methodical persistence. Knox pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine and sat on the bike for a moment with his hands on his thighs. The ride down had been the kind of ride that clarified things whether you wanted them clarified or not. 40 minutes of cold air and bad road and nothing between his face and the mountain morning, and by the time the pines had thinned into the outlying structures of Crestview, he'd arrived at a state that was past the performance of composure and into something more fundamental. The quality of attention that came when you'd stripped away everything that wasn't the immediate situation, and what remained was just the machinery of a man who had learned to function inside things that hurt. He checked his phone again. The message was still there. 3 words, 15 years of weight behind them. "I know you're coming." He put the phone away and went inside. The interior smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the particular staleness of a building where difficult conversations happened in low voices all day long. A reception desk. A woman behind it who looked up with the expression of someone who'd developed a professional assessment capability and was currently running it. "Can I help you?" she said, with the specific intonation that meant she'd already made some preliminary determinations. "I'm here about Owen Hale," Knox said. "I'm the one who found him." Her expression modulated, not warmly, but with the acknowledgement that he'd presented a relevant credential. "Ms. Cortez brought him in about an hour ago. Are you family?" "No?" "Then I'm afraid I can't—" "I understand," Knox said. "I'm not here to take him anywhere. I'd like to speak with whoever is the appropriate contact. And I was told someone here was expecting me." A pause. The receptionist did something on her computer, picked up her phone, said something into it in a low voice, listened, set it down. "Someone will be out in a few minutes," she said. Knox took a seat in one of the chairs along the wall. The chair was the kind of institutional seating that was designed for waiting and had succeeded only at being uncomfortable. He sat in it with his back straight and his hands loose on his knees and looked at the middle distance and waited with the discipline of a man who'd spent years in situations where waiting was the job. The door to the inner offices opened at 7 minutes. Grant Hale walked through it. Knox had had 40 minutes on a mountain road to prepare for this moment, and it turned out 40 minutes was not enough. He'd had 15 years of a particular image of Grant Hale. The image from the photograph in the locket, young and grinning, layered with the image his imagination had constructed over the years, the abstract version of a man who'd walked away. Neither of those images had included what was standing in front of him now. Grant Hale was 43 years old and looked like a man who'd been put through something. Not the surface wear of ordinary difficulty, but the deeper kind, the kind that rearranged the architecture of a face. The specific quality of someone who'd been carrying weight that had exceeded the load-bearing capacity and had been doing it long enough that the damage was structural. His hair was shot through with gray at the temples. He'd put on maybe 15 pounds over the years and lost it again, and the second loss showed differently than the first. He was wearing a flannel shirt that Knox recognized from a photograph Owen had apparently described accurately as very old, because the flannel was the exact shirt Grant had been wearing at Fort Bragg during the winter of their second year, a dark green Carhartt that Knox remembered because Grant had borrowed $20 to buy it and paid it back in 2 installments. He stopped 6 feet from Knox. Knox stood up. They looked at each other across 6 feet and 15 years and the specific geometry of everything that had happened and not happened in between. And neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted long enough to establish that whatever happened next was going to be real. Grant spoke first. "You look like hell," he said. "You look worse," Knox said. Something moved across Grant's face. Not a smile exactly, but the shadow of the mechanism that used to produce one. He gestured toward the inner door. "Come on." The room Grant took him to was a conference room that was trying and failing to be unthreatening. A round table, several chairs, a window that looked at the parking lot. There was a cup of coffee on the table that had been there long enough to be cold. Grant sat in a chair, and Knox sat in the one across from it, and they looked at each other with the table between them. "Owen okay?" Knox asked. "He's with Elaine. He's fine. He's been asking about you since he got here." "What did you tell him?" "That you'd probably come." Grant wrapped both hands around the cold coffee cup without drinking from it. "I knew you would when I saw the report. Mountain Road, mile marker 11, Iron Covenant Clubhouse." He paused. "There's only one man associated with that club who would stop on that road in that storm." "Tell me why he was out there," Knox said. Grant set the cup down. "Claire and I had a fight, a bad one. We've been having bad ones since the divorce was filed. Bad in the specific way where neither of us is handling it, and Owen is the one absorbing the cost." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't know he'd gone out. I was in the back room. By the time I found his coat still on the hook, I'd already lost." Another stop. The sentence didn't finish, but its shape was clear enough. "I've been driving these mountains for 6 hours looking for him." Knox looked at the man across the table and felt the complicated machinery of 15 years of narrative begin to strain against the actual information being presented to it. He'd spent a long time constructing a specific version of Grant Hale. The version that was sitting across from him, gray at the temples and hands wrapped around a cold cup with the controlled devastation of a man who'd spent the night believing his son might be dead, was not a comfortable fit for the construction. "The locket," Knox said. Grant's jaw tightened. "He was wearing it," Knox said. "It was around his neck." "I know what he was wearing. There's a photograph in it." "Knox, why does your 6-year-old son have a photograph of the two of us from Fort Bragg around his neck in a blizzard?" The question was flat and direct, and it landed in the room with its full weight. Grant looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at Knox with an expression that was the specific expression of a man who'd been preparing for a conversation for a long time, and now that the conversation had arrived was finding that preparation and readiness were different things. "Because I told him you were worth knowing about," Grant said. "Why?" "Because you are." "Grant." Knox said the name the way you say a word when you need it to carry more than its face value. "I waited 3 hours and 40 minutes at that bar. I have a very specific memory of what it felt like when I paid the tab and walked out. I'd like you to explain to me what I was carrying for 15 years and why." Grant was quiet for a moment. Outside, the parking lot held its ordinary morning. A cloud moved and the light changed, and the window showed Knox the side of Grant's face in profile. The jaw he'd seen replicated in miniature in Owen's face at 4 in the morning. "Do you remember Hendricks?" Grant asked. Knox stilled. "Lieutenant Hendricks." "Yeah." Knox remembered Hendricks. You didn't forget a man like Hendricks, who had occupied the specific territory between commanding officer and personal threat with such efficient brutality that you sometimes wondered years later whether the territory had existed before him or whether he'd created it. Lieutenant Aaron Hendricks, who had been the third man in the disciplinary hearing where Grant had testified on Knox's behalf, testified accurately, in direct opposition to what Hendricks had wanted said, and who had walked out of that hearing with a specific quality of silence that Knox had logged at the time and then set aside because the hearing had gone their way, and sometimes the dragon stayed in the cave. Sometimes it didn't. "He came to me 6 weeks after the hearing," Grant said, "after you'd already left base. He had photographs." A pause. "Of you." Knox waited. "Not incriminating ones. It wasn't that kind of operation. It was subtler. He had photographs of you at specific locations at specific times, and he had documentation showing that those times corresponded to incidents that were under investigation. Nothing that would hold in court, but enough to—" Grant stopped. "He made it very clear that if I maintained contact with you, the documentation would find its way to a formal inquiry, and the inquiry wouldn't go the way the hearing had." The room was very quiet. "He said you'd be looking at a federal matter," Grant said. "Not military. Federal. Something that had been attached to your file from the second deployment, the one nobody talked about. I didn't know enough about what actually happened over there to know if the documentation was legitimate or manufactured, and that was the point. That was exactly the point." Knox was sitting very still in a way that was not stillness, but the management of something that was not still at all. "You could have told me," Knox said. "He had someone watching. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a justification that you could have told me and we could have dealt with it." "Knox." Grant's voice came down hard, and then immediately softer, the modulation of a man catching himself. "You were already out. You had already started over. I made a calculation, a wrong one. I know that now. I have known it for 15 years. But I made the calculation that the cleanest way to protect you was to not be the thing they used to get to you." Knox looked at him across the table. He felt the specific quality of what it was like to have the load-bearing wall of a 15-year story removed. The sensation was not relief, not immediately. It was the structural exposure that came before relief, the moment where everything that had been held up by the wrong thing was suddenly holding up nothing, and you could see how long the wrong architecture had been in place. "You disappeared," Knox said, "to protect me." "Yes." "And then stayed disappeared." Something crossed Grant's face. "The first year, I was afraid of Hendricks. The second year, I started to think you'd moved on. The third year, I met Claire and—" He stopped. "The years are an explanation, not an excuse. I know the difference. Hendricks, Knox said. Where is he now? Grant's expression changed, and this was where Knox first felt it. The shift in the room's temperature that was not about heat, the specific quality of an atmosphere that has introduced a new variable and is waiting for someone to notice. That's the part I need to tell you, Grant said. He reached into his flannel shirt pocket and set a photograph on the table. It was a surveillance photograph, digital print recently made, the kind produced by a directional camera at medium range. It showed a parking lot Knox didn't recognize. 2 vehicles, 2 men. One of the men was Decker. Knox picked up the photograph. He looked at it with the careful attention of someone who is gathering information before deciding what to do with it, because the alternative, reacting immediately, was not something he could afford. When was this taken? Knox asked. 3 days ago, Grant said. Crestview, the parking lot behind the hardware store on Mill Street. Knox looked at the second man in the photograph. He was heavy-set, 50s, in a gray coat. The kind of anonymous that was practiced rather than natural. Who's the other man? Knox asked. His name is Reese Dunbar, Grant said. He works for Hendricks. He has been working for Hendricks in various capacities for about 20 years. He is currently, as far as I can document, the primary collector in a debt operation that Hendricks runs through 3 shell companies out of Asheville. Knox set the photograph down very carefully. Decker doesn't know Hendricks, Knox said. Are you certain of that? The question was flat. No accusation in it. Worse than accusation. Just the blank face of genuine inquiry of someone who was asking because they actually didn't know and needed Knox to be the one who knew. Knox thought about Decker. He thought about 12 years of Decker, the specific accumulated texture of a man he trusted in the specific category of people he trusted most, which was a short category with very selective admission criteria. He thought about the photograph, Decker in a parking lot in Crestview 3 days ago, before the storm, before Knox had found Owen on the road. He thought about the fact that Decker had not mentioned being in Crestview 3 days ago. Tell me about Dunbar, Knox said. Grant leaned forward, and Knox could see now, in the posture, in the forward lean, in the specific quality of attention Grant was bringing to this, that the man across the table was not simply a father trying to recover his son and a lost friend. He was a man who had been working on something for a while, who had built a picture carefully and was bringing Knox into it at the point where the picture had become dangerous to hold alone. Dunbar has been in Harlan County for 2 months, Grant said. Moving around, talking to people associated with the Iron Covenant. Not obvious about it. He's good. Hendricks trains them well. But I've been watching because Hendricks's name surfaced in something I was involved with through work, and I recognized the operational signature. What do you do now? Knox asked. For work. Risk analysis. Private sector. It started as something I fell into and turned into something else. A pause. It turns out 15 years of watching for threats that aren't obvious is a transferable skill. What surfaced? Knox asked. With Hendricks. A land deal, Grant said, or what looks like a land deal from the outside. Parcels up on the mountain, the north face of the ridge above your clubhouse. They've been quietly acquired over the past 8 months through shell purchases. The parcels control the access road, the only road in and out of the Iron Covenant property. Knox was very still. Someone, Grant said, has been building a position to control your club's access to its own property. And 3 days ago, Hendricks' primary collector was in a parking lot in Crestview meeting with your vice president. The fluorescent light above the conference table made its small perpetual sound. Outside in the parking lot, the wind moved a plastic bag across the asphalt in a slow, purposeless circle. Knox picked up the photograph again. He looked at Decker's face, the specific angle of it, the way the body was positioned relative to Dunbar's. He'd spent 12 years learning to read Decker's body language with the accuracy of long familiarity. He looked at the photograph and read what the body was saying, and what it was saying was not the body language of a man conducting a covert meeting with an enemy operative. It was the body language of a man receiving bad news. Decker's not working with them, Knox said. How do you know? Because I know what his body looks like when he's in control of a situation. That's not that. Knox set the photograph down. That's a man being told something he doesn't want to hear. What I don't know is what he was told and why he didn't bring it to me. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then, there's something else. Knox looked at him. Grant pulled his phone from his pocket. He turned it to face Knox. On the screen was a text message chain, the kind of chain that had been going for a while between a number identified only as Dunbar and a number that Knox did not recognize. I have a contact in Hendrix's organization, Grant said. Not deep in, shallow enough to be deniable, deep enough to be useful. He got me this 2 days ago. Knox read the message chain. He read it twice. The first time to gather the information. The second time because some part of him needed the information to mean something different on the second reading. It didn't. The message chain, in the compressed operational language of people who assumed they were being monitored and were hedging accordingly, described a plan. The plan had a timeline, 3 weeks. It had an objective, described in terms abstract enough to require interpretation, but not so abstract as to be unclear. And it had a name attached to the objective, a name that was not Decker's, that was not Grant's, that was not a property parcel or a shell company. The name was Knox. He's been waiting, Grant said. Hendrix has been waiting 15 years for a clean shot at something that will hold. The land play is leverage. It's not the operation. It's the setup. What he actually wants is to move against the club in a way that sticks. Federal Knox. The same word he used with me 15 years ago. Grant's voice was measured, but underneath the measure, Knox could hear the thing that had been driving the man for however long he'd been sitting on this information. He's been building a case, and someone inside your organization has been feeding it. Decker, Knox said. I don't know, maybe not voluntarily. The message chain suggests someone who doesn't know they're being used. Knox put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. The knuckles, the calluses, the specific wear of hands that had been doing physical work since he was 17. He thought about the mountain. He thought about last night, the fire, the boy, the locket. He thought about riding down the mountain this morning with the sensation that something was resolving, that the 15 years of misdirected carrying was about to be set down. He thought about Decker's face when Knox had said this one I do alone. How long have you had this? Knox asked. The message chain, 2 days. The suspicion about Dunbar's presence in the county, 6 weeks. Grant paused. I was trying to verify before I didn't know how to reach you. And then Owen, his voice changed, something in it going briefly raw before he got it back under control. Owen ending up in that storm, ending up with you. That's not something I planned for or expected. You think it changes the timeline? I think Hendrix knows you and I are in contact now. I think the photograph of Decker was sent to me as a message. Not by my contact, he didn't send it. I got it through a different channel 3 hours ago. Someone wanted me to have it. Someone who knows both of us are connected to the club and to each other. Knox looked at him. Hendrix sent you that photograph. Yes, Grant said. He's telling us he knows. He's telling us that whatever he's built, he's confident enough in it to show us the edge of it. The confidence of a man who believed the thing he'd built was already done. Knox stood up from the table. He moved to the window and looked at the parking lot with its 3 vehicles and its ordinary morning and thought about the mountain road and the clubhouse sitting up there in the post-blizzard quiet with 5 men in it who had been his brothers for varying periods of time and did not currently know that someone had spent 8 months building the architecture of their destruction. I need to make a call, Knox said. Knox! Grant's voice caught him. Knox turned. Grant was standing now too, and for the first time since he'd walked through the inner door, the specific professional control of the man was not fully present. Underneath it, visible in the way things become visible when the container isn't quite sufficient, was something older, something that had the specific quality of a thing carried for 15 years. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix the math, but I need you to know. Knox looked at him across the conference table. He thought about the bar on Clement Street. 3 hours and 40 minutes. He thought about the story he'd built on the foundation of that waiting, the story that had shaped 12 years of the Iron Covenant and a particular way of living that had its own integrity, even if its origin was wrong. He thought about a 6-year-old boy who had walked into a blizzard looking for quiet and had been carrying proof of this moment around his neck. I know, Knox said. He pulled out his phone and called Decker. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again, same result. He called Rooster. Rooster picked up on the second ring with the background ambient sound of the clubhouse morning, coffee and a low radio and the particular acoustic quality of the old stone building. Where's Decker? Knox asked. A pause. He went out about an hour ago, didn't say where. On his bike? Truck. Knox turned from the window. Grant was watching him with the focused attention of someone who understood operational situations. Rooster, Knox said, I need you to do something for me without asking questions right now. Okay. I need you to make sure nobody leaves the property. I need Mackie on the door. Tell him it's a precaution. Don't tell him what you're precautioning against. A beat. And I need you to check the safe room. Make sure the documentation in there is exactly as it should be. A silence on the line that had the texture of understanding more than was being said. Knox, what's happening? I'll explain when I'm back. Just do those things. He hung up. He looked at Grant. I need to find Decker, Knox said. I'll come with you. Grant, he doesn't know me. That's an advantage. Grant said it with the flat practicality of someone who'd been moving around operational situations for a while. And I've been tracking Dunbar's movement patterns in this county for 6 weeks. If Decker is meeting him, I have a good idea where. Knox looked at the man who had been his brother and then his wound and was now, with the specific efficiency of a situation that had no patience for the pace of personal reconciliation, becoming something necessary. Owen, Knox said. Elaine Cortez will be with him. He's safe in this building. Something moved across Grant's face, a quick tightening. Safer than anywhere else right now. Knox held the look for a moment. Then he moved toward the door. They went out through the back of the building into the cold morning air of the parking lot, Knox's bike sitting where he'd left it with the cold already resettling into the engine. He rolled it away from the building before starting it, reducing the sound signature, and waited for Grant's car, a dark blue Ford pickup with 2 years of Appalachian roads on it, to pull up alongside. Grant rolled down the window. Mill Street parking lot is my best bet. But if Dunbar's changed his pattern, there's a secondary location. A garage on the east side of town, Carver Auto. It's been closed for 8 months, but the lights have been on intermittently. We split it, Knox said. Well, Knox, I know this county better than you do. You take Mill Street. I take Carver Auto. You find something, you call me before you approach. Grant held the look for 2 seconds, the specific look of a man evaluating a tactical decision against his instinct to argue with it. 3 minutes either way, we compare notes, Grant said. 3 minutes, Knox said. He pulled out. Carver Auto was on the east edge of Crestview in the landscape of light industry, an abandoned ambition that occupied the fringes of most small Appalachian towns. A garage-bay structure with a faded sign and roll-up doors that faced a service road running parallel to the rail line. Knox came at it from the south, cutting the engine 2 blocks out and walking the bike the last distance in a silence that cost him effort in the cold, the bike's weight demanding constant negotiation on the uneven surface. He left it in the shadow of a chain-link fence and went the last 100 yards on foot. The lights were on inside. He could see it at the edge of the roll-up door gap. A thin line of artificial light at the bottom of the door on the far left. The specific quality of work lights, not overhead fluorescents, but the portable kind, the kind you brought to a location where the permanent electrical situation was not operational. He heard Decker's voice before he reached the door. He stopped, stood in the cold service road with his back against the exterior wall of the garage and listened. Decker was not alone. There were 2 voices. Decker's, which Knox could have identified in a crowd of 1,000 by the specific register and cadence of it, and a second voice that was unknown, measured, with the particular smoothness of a man who spent a lot of time managing conversations toward predetermined outcomes. He couldn't hear the words clearly. He moved closer to the edge of the roll-up door gap and crouched against the base of the wall where the gap let out an inch of warm air and sound. Not what we agreed, Decker was saying. The specific tone of Decker's voice when he was controlling anger. Knox knew this voice like he knew his own breathing. You said it was information. You didn't say you'd use it. The information was used the way it needed to be used, the other voice said. The arrangement doesn't change. The arrangement changes the minute you put Knox in a federal file, Decker said. That was never part of what I agreed to. Knox's hand, which had been flat against the cold exterior wall of the garage, pressed harder without him deciding to. You agreed, the smooth voice said, to provide information about the club's operations in exchange for the resolution of your brother's situation. Your brother's situation was resolved. That transaction is complete. My brother's situation was resolved because you manufactured a reason to resolve it and then held it over my head for 2 years, Decker said. Don't dress that up as a favor. A silence. The next phase, the smooth voice said, doesn't require your participation. You can walk out of this garage and go back to your club and spend the next 3 weeks watching what happens. Or you can continue cooperating and position yourself to... I'm not positioning myself for anything. Decker's voice had dropped to the register it went to when the control was running thin. I'm done with this. Whatever you're building, whatever Hendricks thinks he's... You were done, the smooth voice said, when we decided you were done. Knox heard something then. Not words, but the sound of something physical, the specific acoustic of a large man's body making contact with a hard surface. A grunt. The sound of boots on concrete. He went through the gap at the base of the roll-up door in a movement that was not planned but was not uncontrolled. The body's own knowledge of what came next, the specific grammar of intervening before the situation wrote its own ending. The inside of the garage was 2 work lights in shadows and 3 men. Decker was against the far wall, not down. His shoulder had taken the contact and he was still upright, the specific posture of a man absorbing force and deciding what to do about it. The smooth voice belonged to a heavy-set man in a gray coat who Knox recognized from the parking lot photograph as Reese Dunbar. The third man was younger, mid-20s, with the particular compact quality of someone who'd been trained to be efficient at specific tasks. Dunbar saw Knox. His face registered something. Not surprise, but the recalibration of a man whose plan has encountered an unscheduled variable. Knox Mercer, Dunbar said. The arrangement, Knox said, is over. Mr. Mercer, you have about 45 seconds before this becomes a situation you don't have enough people for, Knox said. I'd suggest using them to tell me exactly what Hendricks has built and where it lives. Dunbar looked at him. He looked at Decker. He looked at the younger man beside him with the particular look of someone doing a tactical calculation and arriving at a number he didn't like. You don't have leverage here, Dunbar said. Then why are you still talking instead of leaving? Knox said. The younger man moved. Knox had been watching for it from the moment he came through the gap. The specific pre-movement tension in the shoulder, the weight shift. He was already moving when it happened, inside the angle of it, and what followed was brief and functional, and when it finished, the younger man was on the concrete floor with Knox's knee on his back and the specific stillness of someone who had been efficiently interrupted. Dunbar had not moved. He was watching Knox with an expression that had recalibrated again, this time towards something that was receding from confidence and approaching the calculation of a man who was reassessing how the morning was going to end. The file, Knox said. What's in it? You don't want to know what's in it, Dunbar said. Knowing puts you in a worse position than... Tell me or Hendricks gets you back in pieces, Knox said. Those are the 2 options. Dunbar looked at him for a long moment. The work lights hummed. Outside, the rail line ran its cold geometry through the morning. Somewhere in the middle distance, Knox could hear a motorcycle engine. Not approaching, just present, the ambient sound of a town where people rode through winter. Dunbar said, The file has enough to move on 6 members of your club for federal conspiracy charges. The land acquisition closes escrow in 18 days. When it does, you lose access to the property and the legal standing to contest it collapses simultaneously. Hendricks has a buyer for the property who will close within 72 hours of the access road transferring. A pause. The information came from inside your organization. Not all of it from your VP. Some of it is older. Some of it goes back further than you're going to be comfortable with. Knox looked at Decker across the garage. Decker's face was the face of a man standing in the wreckage of a decision made under duress years ago, watching the full scale of what it had cost become visible all at once. There was no performance in it. There was just the thing itself. The specific devastation of a man who'd been trying to protect something and had instead been used as the instrument of its destruction. "My brother," Decker said. His voice was the voice of someone saying the only true thing they have left. "They had my brother, 3 years ago. The thing in Roanoke. They manufactured it, Knox. I found out 6 months in that it was manufactured, and by then I'd already given them enough that they could use it to—" He stopped. The sentence had run into something it couldn't get past. "I was trying to get out of it. I've been trying to get out of it for 2 years. And then Owen showed up last night, and you left for Crestview, and I came here to tell Dunbar it was finished." Knox looked at him. He looked at the man who was his brother, the word he'd used this morning to Elaine Cortez, the word he'd meant, and he felt the full, undefended weight of what was in the room, what was in the garage, and what was in the mountain, and what was in 18 days of a clock that had been running while Knox was living inside a wrong story. "How much does Hendricks have?" Knox asked. Decker was quiet for a moment. "Enough," he said. The word landed in the garage with the finality of a door closing. Outside, the motorcycle engine in the middle distance got slightly louder, then held. Knox registered it with the part of his attention that ran continuously beneath everything else, the part that had learned in 2 deployments to track sound as a primary survival input. 2 motorcycles now, getting closer. Knox stood up from the younger man on the floor, who had the sense to stay down. He looked at Dunbar. "Walk out of here. You call Hendricks, and you tell him the timeline has changed. You tell him Knox Mercer is aware and the situation is no longer what it was. That won't stop what's—" "I know it won't stop it," Knox said. "I'm not trying to stop it. I'm trying to make sure he knows I'm coming." Dunbar held the look for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Then he turned and walked out the side door of the garage with the younger man behind him, and the sound of their footsteps crossed the service road and disappeared. Knox stood in the garage with Decker and the 2 work lights, and the hum of the fluorescents and the growing sound of motorcycles outside. "Knox," Decker said. "Don't," Knox said. "I need you to—" "Not right now." Knox turned to face him and let Decker see whatever was on his face, which he wasn't managing at the moment. "Right now we have 18 days and a federal file and 5 brothers on a mountain who don't know any of this yet. We are going to get in front of that. We are going to deal with every piece of it, and we are going to come out the other side." He paused. "And then you and I are going to have the conversation that we need to have, but not now, not here." Decker looked at him with the eyes of a man who knew he was being given something he hadn't earned and wasn't sure he deserved, and was taking it anyway because the alternative was to drown. "Okay," Decker said. Knox's phone buzzed. "Grant," he picked up. "Mill Street was empty," Grant said. "But Knox, I just got a call from my contact. Hendricks moved the timeline up. He knows you're in Crestview. He knows you found Dunbar." A pause, and in the pause, Knox heard something that Grant Hale, who had spent 15 years building the specific skill of managing dangerous information with professional composure, had apparently not been able to keep entirely out of his voice. "He's filing the federal motion in 72 hours, not 18 days. And there's something else in the file, Knox. Something I didn't know about until 30 minutes ago. Something that doesn't involve the club." Knox stood in the garage with the work lights humming and the motorcycles outside having arrived now, their engines idling at the service road. "Tell me," Knox said. "It involves Owen," Grant said. "Hendricks has documentation, so fabricated, I'm almost certain it's fabricated, but documented enough to move on. That ties you to a situation involving the boy, not the rescue, something older, something that would give him standing to argue that Owen being in your custody last night was not incidental." Knox processed this. He processed the specific architecture of what Hendricks had built, the land, the federal conspiracy, and now this, the 3rd leg of it, the one that was personal in a way the other 2 weren't and was designed to be, designed to remove the one thing that might give Knox a reason to fight that was bigger than survival. They were going to use Owen to get to Knox. And Knox Mercer, who had ridden through a blizzard and carried a child through 400 yards of whiteout and sat through a night in a mountain clubhouse watching a boy breathe and made a promise he intended to keep, felt something shift in the center of him, Something fundamental, something that had nothing to do with the club or the federal file or 15 years of misdirected anger. He felt the specific quality of a man who has just discovered that the thing he's willing to burn everything down to protect is not the thing he thought it was. It was a 6-year-old boy, and the people who had just made themselves a threat to that boy had made the last miscalculation of their considerable careers. "I'll call you back in 5 minutes," Knox said. He hung up. He stood in the garage. Outside, Decker had walked to the roll-up door and raised it, and the cold morning air of Crestview came in with the gray light, and 2 Iron Covenant bikes were sitting on the service road with their engines idling and Rooster and Mackie on them, because apparently Rooster's interpretation of make sure nobody leaves the property had been more flexible than Knox had intended. Rooster looked at Knox through the open door with the expression of a man who'd ridden 40 minutes down a mountain on the instinct that something was happening and had arrived to find out he was right. "What do you need?" Rooster said. Knox looked at the service road, looked at the cold sky above Crestview, looked at the specific geography of a situation that had closed off every exit except the one that went directly through the center of the thing. 72 hours. A federal motion. A 6-year-old boy with a locket and his father's jaw, and the specific courage of a child who had walked into a blizzard rather than keep listening to the sound of things breaking. Knox walked out of the garage into the cold morning air and looked at his brothers on their bikes and felt the specific weight of what he was about to ask them to ride into, and felt also, underneath that weight, something that had been absent for a long time. The particular clarity that came when you had stopped managing the truth and started moving toward it. "Start your engines," Knox said. They rode back up the mountain in formation. Not the loose, comfortable spacing of men going somewhere familiar. This was tighter, deliberate, the specific geometry of a group that had shifted from traveling to moving with purpose. Knox out front, Rooster and Mackie flanking, Decker in the rear. Grant's truck followed at a distance that was close enough to be part of the thing, and far enough to acknowledge that he was not yet fully part of it, that there was a specific grammar to the Iron Covenant's movement, and he hadn't earned the right to ride inside it. The mountain road was cleaner than it had been at dawn. The county plow had made one pass and left behind the particular surface of post-storm asphalt, salt-streaked, uneven, with patches of ice still living in the shadows where the sun hadn't reached. Knox rode it at a pace that was faster than sensible and slower than what his body wanted, because his body wanted to be somewhere that hadn't been reached yet, and speed was not going to close that distance faster than the situation would allow. 72 hours had become 68 by the time they cleared the last switchback and the clubhouse came into view. He'd been on the phone for most of the ride. One earbud, which he hated, a concession to the fact that the next few hours required more coordination than one man in motion could manage alone. He'd talked to a lawyer in Asheville whose name he'd had in his phone for 2 years under a category he'd hoped to never use. He'd talked to Grant twice more, getting pieces of the picture that Grant had been assembling for 6 weeks and was now deploying with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that information was only as useful as the speed with which it reached the right hands. He'd talked to Mackie, riding 20 feet to his right, about the documentation in the safe room. What was there? What was clean? What could be used in the specific way that documentation became a weapon when the person holding it understood its value? He had not talked to Decker. Decker had ridden the whole mountain in silence, which was not unusual for Decker, but the quality of this silence was different from the ordinary kind. It was the silence of a man processing the specific weight of being known, not the comfortable knowledge of people who had chosen to know you, but the involuntary exposure of being seen in the worst configuration of yourself by someone whose opinion was not peripheral. Knox had felt that silence in his rearview mirror the whole way up. He parked in front of the clubhouse and killed his engine and sat for a moment while the others pulled in around him. The mountain was doing what it did after a major storm. The specific, almost aggressive quiet of a landscape that has spent itself completely and is now simply present. The snow deep and unmarked on the north-facing slopes. The air so clear it had a quality adjacent to aggression. Knox got off the bike. "Inside," he said. "All of us." They went in. Grant came in last, closing the door behind him, and stood near it with the particular posture of a man who understood he was in a space where his position was not yet defined and was waiting for it to be. Knox stood in the center of the main room. He looked at the 4 men around him. Rooster, Mackie, Decker, and Patch, who had been in the clubhouse all morning and had the expression of someone who'd been watching events unfold from a distance and had assembled most of the shape of it through inference alone. He said it directly. That was the only way he knew how to do this kind of thing. Not building toward it, not managing the landing, just saying the thing in the order it needed to be said. He laid out the land acquisition, the shell companies, the access road, the 18-day timeline that was now 72 hours, the federal conspiracy file and what it contained and where the information in it had come from. He said Decker's name in that context with the flat neutrality of a man reporting facts rather than delivering verdict, because the verdict wasn't his to deliver, and he'd made a decision in the garage that he was going to live by. He said Grant's name and explained who Grant was and what Grant had been doing for 6 weeks, and why Grant was standing near the door of the Iron Covenant clubhouse at 10:30 in the morning. He said Owen's name last. He said what Hendricks intended to use Owen for. He said it without any of the things he was feeling about it, because what he was feeling about it was not relevant to the next 68 hours and would have to wait. The room was quiet when he finished. Not the quiet of shock. These were not men who shocked easily, but the quiet of men doing rapid and serious internal processing, running the information against their existing maps of the situation and feeling those maps change shape. Rooster spoke first. The lawyer? On it. She's pulling the land filing records tonight. If the shell purchases have any exposure in the documentation chain, she'll find it. That's a civil play, Mackie said. Long timeline. The civil play buys time. Time is what we're buying right now. The federal file is different, Patch said. He was the quietest of them, Patch. Had the specific quality of someone who spoke infrequently because he was usually thinking longer thoughts than the conversation had yet arrived at. You can't buy time against a federal motion once it's filed. Once it's filed, you're responding. I know, Knox said. So what's the play? Patch asked. Knox looked at Grant. Grant moved away from the door and came to the table with the specific posture of someone assuming a functional role. Not leadership, because this was not his room and he knew it, but the role of the person who had the most information about a specific piece of the problem. He laid it out. He was precise and brief. The Dunbar operational pattern, the connection to Hendricks's Asheville network, the documentation chain that Grant's contact had been building for 2 months. He explained the contact's position, shallow enough to be deniable, deep enough to have been present for 3 specific conversations between Hendricks and his legal team that had been recorded on a device the contact was wearing without Hendricks's knowledge. Recorded conversations between Hendricks and his lawyers, discussing the fabrication of evidence. The room's quality changed when Grant said this. It changed the way a room changes when someone sets something down on the table that nobody expected to be there. Your contact will testify? Rooster asked. My contact will provide the recordings, Grant said. Testimony is a different conversation that depends on what protections we can establish. How solid are the recordings? Mackie asked. Solid enough that Hendricks's lawyers would recognize them as a problem. Not solid enough that I'd bet everything on them alone. Grant paused. But combined with the documentation chain and the testimony of a federal law enforcement officer who has been investigating Hendricks's network for the past 14 months. There's a federal investigation already running on Hendricks, Knox said. Has been for over a year. The agent in charge is named Britta Voss. She works out of the Asheville field office. I've been in contact with her for 6 weeks. A beat. She's been waiting for someone on the inside of Hendrick's operation to break cover. The recordings give her that. The room processed this. You've been running a parallel operation, Knox said. I've been trying to protect my son from a man who is going to use him as a weapon, Grant said. I used the tools I had. Knox looked at him. He thought about 15 years. He thought about the specific cost of a man who'd spent that long watching a threat and managing it alone, in the specific isolation that came from not being able to bring it to the people who might have helped carry it. He thought about what it had taken from Grant, not as an abstraction, but in the concrete currency of years and relationships, and the accumulated toll of sustained vigilance without relief. He thought about the bar on Clement Street. He thought that there were two men in this room who had been carrying things alone for 15 years, and that the weight had compounded with interest in both of them, and that the compounding was over now, whether they wanted it to be or not. 68 hours, Knox said. Patch, I need you on the access road documentation. Anything in the county filing system that has exposure, anything that was filed incorrectly or has chain of title problems, you find it by tonight. Patch was already moving. Mackie, I need the safe room inventory audited against what Decker told me was accessed. I need to know exactly what's in the federal file so we know what we're responding to. Mackie nodded, something in his face careful and deliberate about not looking at Decker. Rooster, Britta Voss, I need a verified contact and I need it in the next 2 hours. I can have it in one, Rooster said. One, then. He looked at Decker last. Decker was standing slightly apart from the others, the way a man stands when he's not sure whether the space he's standing in is still his. He was holding himself with the controlled stillness of someone managing a great deal with not much room to put it. Knox walked to him. He stood close enough that the conversation was between them, that the other men in the room who were already moving to their respective tasks could observe it but not quite hear it. The things you gave them, Knox said quietly, I need to know exactly what they were, not for what you think I'm going to do with it. I need to know because knowing is the only way I can build a defense that covers the club instead of just you. Decker met his eyes. There was something in Decker's face that Knox had not seen there in 12 years. Something that was past pride and past shame and into the raw territory beyond both of them. It's going to be bad, Decker said. I know. Some of it goes back further than me. I know that too. Decker looked at the floor, looked back up. Your brother, he said. Not the club, not the operation. My actual brother, Knox. He was 19 years old, and they had him in a situation that... Decker. Knox said his name the way he'd said Grant's name in the conference room, carrying more than its face value. Tell me what they have. That's the conversation we're having right now. The other conversation, you and me, we'll get there. Decker held the look for a moment. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. All right. They sat down. The next 3 hours were the specific work of men in a situation with a hard deadline. The kind of focused, unglamorous, exhausting labor that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but is the substance of whether you survive what's coming. Knox and Decker went through it piece by piece, Knox asking and Decker answering, and Knox building the map in his head of the exact shape of what Hendricks had, translating it as he built the map into what a federal prosecutor would do with each piece and what a defense required in response. It was not pleasant. There were moments when Knox had to stop and breathe through the specific discomfort of sitting with information that made him want to stand up and put his fist through something. And there were moments when Decker's voice went to places that required Knox to make a conscious decision about what kind of man he was going to be in response to them. He made the decision the same way each time. He kept his voice flat and his questions operational. Whatever was happening in his chest, he kept it there. Grant moved through the clubhouse with a quiet efficiency that Knox watched peripherally and found himself, against his expectation, grateful for. Grant understood how to be useful in an environment where he wasn't the primary. He filled spaces without occupying them, contributed information when asked and was silent when not, and navigated the specific social terrain of men who didn't fully trust him with a combination of patience and honesty that Knox recognized from a long time ago as one of the things he'd valued most about him. At 1:30, Rooster put Britta Voss on speakerphone. She had the voice of someone who'd been doing this work for long enough that the urgency had been absorbed into the baseline. Not flat, but steady in a way that had been earned. Mr. Mercer, she said, I've been expecting this call for about 3 weeks. You knew about the timeline? Knox asked. I knew Hendricks was accelerating. I didn't know the 72-hour move until 40 minutes ago when Mr. Hale's contact forwarded me the update. A pause. I need to be straight with you about where we are. The federal investigation has been building toward a motion against Hendricks's network for 14 months. What we don't have is the evidentiary anchor that would make the motion stick on the fabrication charges. The thing that shows Hendricks didn't just build a file on your club, but manufactured elements of it. The recordings are close, but there are authentication issues I need resolved before I can put them in front of a judge. What resolves the authentication issues? Knox asked. Someone who is present for the conversations corroborating their content under oath, Voss said, or physical evidence from the space where the recordings were made that establishes the participants were there. Your contact, Knox said to Grant. Grant's jaw was tight. He'll do it, he said. It'll cost him, but he'll do it. I need him in Asheville by tomorrow morning, Voss said. If he's in Asheville by tomorrow morning, I can have the authentication resolved and a counter motion ready to file simultaneous with Hendrix's motion. That turns it from a prosecution into a litigation, and litigation Hendrix can lose. And the land? Knox asked. That's civil. The federal motion is what gives you leverage to stall the civil action. Once I file, Hendrix's lawyers will pull back from everything because they'll be managing a different fire. The land deal doesn't close while the principal is under active federal scrutiny. That's usually how it goes. Usually, Knox noted. Not always. What do you need from us? Knox asked. Documentation of what was provided to Hendrix's operation, who provided it, under what circumstances. Voluntarily submitted with a cooperation agreement that protects the individual who provided it from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure. She said this with the specific neutrality of someone who had made this offer before and understood what it cost the person on the receiving end to accept it. I'll need that agreement executed by end of business today. Decker, sitting across the table, had been listening. His face had not changed during the call in a way that was the specific effort of not letting it change. Now he looked at Knox. Knox looked back at him. The cooperation agreement meant Decker walked into a federal process and disclosed everything. It meant the specific exposure of everything he'd been carrying for 3 years, not to Knox, not to the club, but to a federal agent who would document and use it. It meant the end of the version of himself that had been managing this alone. It also meant the club survived it. When do you need an answer? Decker asked. I need the agreement executed by 5 o'clock, Voss said. If it's not on my desk by 5, my counter motion doesn't file simultaneously with Hendrix's, and you're responding instead of countering. Decker looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at Knox with the expression of a man standing at the edge of the thing he'd been circling for 3 years and had finally run out of room to keep circling. I'll be in Asheville by 3, Decker said. The call ended. The room was quiet for a moment in a way that had a specific texture. The quiet of a decision made with all its weight and irreversibility. Then Mackey's phone went off. The sound of it was wrong. The specific ringtone Mackey used for numbers that weren't in his contacts. The one he kept distinct from everything else for operational reasons. He looked at the screen. His face did something. It's a Crestview number, he said. Knox was across the room before Mackey had finished the sentence. He took the phone. Yes? It was Elaine Cortez's voice, not the professionally managed version from the morning. This was different, compressed, with a specific quality of someone speaking carefully because they were in a space where careful speech was required. Mr. Mercer, I'm calling because I have a situation and you're the only contact I have for Grant Hale currently. A pause. Is he available? He's here, Knox said. What's the situation? Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that exists because what follows, it requires a specific kind of receiving. There are 2 men in the parking lot of this facility, Elaine Cortez said. They arrived 40 minutes ago. They identified themselves as federal contractors conducting a welfare check related to an active investigation. I have their credentials, which appear legitimate, but something about the situation is a controlled breath. They're asking to take Owen into their temporary custody pending the completion of an investigation. They have paperwork. Mr. Mercer, the paperwork has the right letterheads and the right case numbers, but something about the men is not... Don't let them in, Knox said. I've been stalling, she said. They're becoming insistent. One of them is on the phone right now with what he says is a supervisor who can authorize... Elaine. He used her first name without planning to. Do not let those men inside that building. Lock the front door and call Crestview PD right now. Not county. City Police, Crestview PD. Tell them you have a custody dispute with individuals presenting questionable federal credentials. They will come. A silence. Okay, she said. Okay. But Mr. Mercer, Owen knows something is wrong. He's been asking for you since he woke up from his nap 20 minutes ago. Her voice caught, just briefly, the professional composure slipping a millimeter. He said to tell you you promised. Knox was already moving toward the door. Behind him, he heard Grant's chair scrape back, heard Rooster's boots on the wood floor, heard Mackie saying something into his own phone in the rapid, compressed cadence of a man activating something. We're coming, Knox said into the phone. Keep the door locked. Crestview PD, do it now. He ended the call. He looked at the room. Rooster already had his jacket, Mackie was on his phone, Patch was at the window with his eyes on the road below. Grant was standing with his keys in his hand and an expression that was the specific expression of a father who has received information about his child that has bypassed every layer of professional composure and landed directly in the place where there are no layers. Hendricks moved, Knox said. He's going for Owen. Grant was already at the door. Grant! Knox's voice was hard enough to stop him. We go together. We go controlled. You go through that door right now alone, and you're a father in a parking lot, and whatever those men are, they're ready for a father in a parking lot. You go with us, and it's different. Grant turned. The look on his face was the look of a man for whom every instinct was pointed in one direction and who was being asked to choose something other than instinct. 2 seconds. The longest 2 seconds Knox had experienced since the mountain road in the blizzard. Grant gave him the 2 seconds. Then let's go, he said. They went out into the afternoon. The ride down was different from every other ride Knox had made on this road. He pushed the bike harder than the surface warranted, taking the switchbacks with the specific economy of someone who had ridden this road enough times that the thinking was below the level of thought. And beside him and behind him, the other machines made their own negotiations with the ice and the grade, and the sound of 4 Harleys descending a mountain at speed was a sound that the winter afternoon absorbed with the indifference of landscape that had seen everything. He was thinking about Owen. He was thinking about a 6-year-old boy who had walked into a blizzard looking for quiet and had found an empty mountain road and a man on a motorcycle who almost didn't stop. He was thinking about the specific courage of a child who understood that the adults around him were breaking under weight they were pretending not to carry, and who had found his own way of managing it, which was to walk toward the mountain until the sound of the breaking was far enough away. He was thinking about the locket, the photograph inside it, 2 men in their mid-20s, one grinning, one not, and about what it meant that a man had carried that photograph for 15 years and then put it around his son's neck as proof that good people existed in the world. He was thinking about a promise. Knox Mercer did not break promises. This was not a personality trait or a point of pride. It was a structural element, the kind of thing that, if you removed it, changed the load-bearing capacity of everything attached to it. He'd made 2 promises in his adult life that he was certain of. The first was to the men riding beside him, in the specific form that Brotherhood took in the Iron Covenant, and the second was to a 6-year-old boy at the door of a county vehicle on a snowy morning. Both of those promises were currently in the same building in Crestview. He hit the county road at the mountain's base and pushed the bike to 70 on a surface that was asking for 55. And behind him he could hear the others doing the same. And ahead of him in the gray afternoon, the lights of Crestview were appearing through the tree line, and his phone was buzzing in his pocket with a number he didn't recognize, and which he did not answer because both hands were on the bars and both eyes were on the road, and there was no version of the next 15 minutes that included stopping. The Family Services building appeared at the far end of Granger Street, and from 2 blocks out, Knox could see the parking lot and what was in it. The county SUV, a dark sedan he didn't recognize, a Crestview PD cruiser that had arrived recently enough that the officer was still getting out of it, and 2 men in gray coats standing near the sedan with the specific stillness of people who were managing a situation that had recently become more complicated than they'd expected. Dunbar's men. Not Dunbar himself. Knox had seen the men in the garage in Carver Auto, and these were different configurations of the same type. Hendricks's operational grammar, deployed in a parking lot in broad daylight because Hendricks had moved his timeline and was confident enough in what he'd built to do it openly. Knox pulled into the parking lot and killed his engine. The sound of 4 Harleys dying simultaneously was its own kind of statement. The 2 men in gray coats turned. The Crestview PD officer, young, maybe 26, with the expression of someone who'd been called to a situation they hadn't fully assessed yet, looked at the four bikers and the truck pulling in behind them with an expression that was recalibrating rapidly. Knox got off his bike. He walked to the officer first, not to the men in gray. The officer, his nameplate said Willis, had his hand near his belt in the way of someone who was maintaining options, and Knox addressed this directly by keeping his own hands visible and his voice at the level of a conversation rather than a confrontation. "Officer Willis," Knox said, "my name is Knox Mercer. I'm the man who found Owen Hale on the mountain last night. I called Ms. Cortez from inside the building to contact Crestview PD because these men," he nodded toward the gray coats without looking at them, keeping his eyes on Willis, "are not who they say they are." "Sir, these men have federal credentials," Willis began. "I'd like you to run those credentials through your dispatch," Knox said. "Right now. Before anyone enters that building, I'm asking you to do one thing, run the credentials, and if they come back clean, I will stand here and not say another word." Willis looked at him, looked at the gray coats, looked at the 4 Iron Covenant patches visible on the men standing behind Knox. "That's a reasonable request," Grant said from Knox's left, and his voice had taken on the specific quality of someone who knew how to talk to law enforcement in a way that didn't activate the wrong reflexes. "I'm Owen Hale's father, Grant Hale. I have ID." He produced his wallet, opened it, held it out. "I'm asking you to verify the credentials of these men before they have any access to my son." Willis took Grant's ID. He looked at it. He looked at the gray coats. He keyed his radio. The gray coat on the left moved, not toward Willis, toward Knox. He moved with the specific efficiency of someone who'd been trained to manage situations that were becoming inconvenient, and what he was reaching for was not a weapon. It was a phone, which was in some ways worse because a phone meant documentation, and documentation at this specific moment meant he was establishing a record of something that Knox hadn't identified yet. Knox stepped between the man and a clear angle to the building's entrance, not aggressively, just occupying the space, the way you occupy space when you want it occupied. "I'd stay where you are," Knox said. "You're interfering with a federal—" "I'm standing in a parking lot," Knox said. "Run your credentials. If they're clean, we all go home." The man looked at him. He had the specific eyes of someone who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in a given situation and was currently doing the math on whether that remained true. His partner's phone rang. The partner answered it, listened for 4 seconds, and his face changed. The change was small, but Knox had been watching faces do things his whole adult life, and he saw it. The specific shift of a man receiving information that has altered the operational calculus. The partner said 2 words into the phone, which Knox couldn't hear, and then lowered it. The 2 men looked at each other. Willis's radio crackled. His dispatch came back with the credentials check, and what the dispatch said made Willis stand up straighter and put both hands on his belt and look at the 2 men in gray coats with a quality of attention that had changed considerably from 30 seconds ago. "Sir," Willis said to the gray coat on the left, "I'm going to need you to step over here." The man didn't move immediately. Knox watched him not move, and he watched the partner doing the calculation, and he felt, with the specific instinct of someone who'd been in rooms where things were about to go wrong for long enough to recognize the pre-movement, that the next 5 seconds were going to determine what shape the next hour took. Grant stepped forward. He stepped forward past Knox, not aggressively, not toward the gray coats, but toward the building's door, which was the direction that mattered. He moved with the specific directness of a father who had reached the end of the perimeter of what he was willing to manage at a distance. "My son is in that building," Grant said. Not to the gray coats, to the air, to the situation, to whatever was listening. "I'm going to him." He walked to the door and knocked twice and said his name. The lock clicked from the inside. The door opened, and the gray coat on the left reached out and put his hand on Grant's arm. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not planned. Knox had spent 15 years in situations that required planning, and he understood the value of it, and he also understood, from the same years, that there was a category of situation where planning was beside the point because the thing that happened was not a decision but a response, the body's own knowledge of what the moment required. Knox moved. He had the man's wrist before the grip on Grant's arm had fully registered. and the specific pressure he applied was not violent, but was categorical. The unambiguous language of a hand that knew exactly how much it would take and was prepared to use it. The man's grip released. His body turned toward Knox with the automatic response of someone whose balance had been redirected. "Don't," Knox said. One word. The full weight of the morning in it. The gray coat looked at him. Knox looked back. Willis was already moving, hand on his radio, saying something into it that would bring more Crestview PD to this parking lot in the next 4 minutes. Rooster had positioned himself between the second gray coat and any angle that mattered. Mackey hadn't moved from beside the bikes, but he had the specific quality of stillness that in a man of his particular background meant he was very ready to stop being still. The gray coat on Knox's wrist made the only decision available to him. He stepped back. Knox released him. Grant went through the door. The sound from inside the building was immediate and specific. The sound that Knox had been carrying in his chest since the parking lot that morning when the county vehicle door had closed. Not a scream. Not distress. Just a child's voice saying a name with the full relief of someone for whom a door opening at the right moment was everything. "Dad?" Knox stood in the parking lot with the cold afternoon air on his face and listened to the specific sound of that word and felt something in his chest that had been clenched since 4 in the morning release, just partially, just enough to breathe differently. The gray coats were being separated by Willis, who had received enough information from his dispatch to know that the situation had become something his department needed to document carefully. Rooster had his phone out and was recording with the patient diligence of someone who understood that the next 72 hours would require evidence. Mackey was talking to someone. Knox couldn't hear who, but the tone and cadence suggested it was someone in Asheville, someone with a legal context for what they were hearing. Decker hadn't come down the mountain. Decker was in his truck, headed to Asheville, to an office where a federal agent named Britta Voss was waiting for a cooperation agreement and the full weight of what one man had been carrying for 3 years. Knox thought about Decker on that drive. He thought about what it took to be the person who walked into that office. Not the person who got caught, not the person compelled by circumstances with no exit, but the person who chose the walk because choosing it was the only way to make the walk mean something. He thought about the specific courage of that choice and about how different kinds of courage looked from the outside, how some of them looked like strength, and some of them looked like surrender, and some of them looked like a large man in a truck driving toward Asheville in the late afternoon, knowing that what he was driving toward was going to cost him everything he'd spent 3 years protecting. He thought that it was possible to have failed someone and still be brave. The building door opened behind him. Grant came out. Owen was in his arms. Not being carried, exactly, but held in the specific way of a small body that had decided the available geography was insufficient and had remedied the problem by occupying as much of his father as physically possible. Owen's face was against Grant's neck and his eyes were closed, and both arms were around Grant's shoulders with the total commitment of a child who has made a structural decision about where the safe place is. Grant looked at Knox across the parking lot. Knox looked at him. There was no speech in it. There was no version of what passed between them that needed language, because language was a secondary system, and what was operating now was primary. The specific recognition between two men who had been carrying the same absence in different directions for 15 years and had arrived through a storm and a mountain road and a 6-year-old boy and a locket with a photograph inside it, at the same place at the same moment. Owen raised his head. He looked at Knox with eyes that were red at the edges, but present, fully present, with the specific quality Knox had recognized at 4 in the morning. The eyes of someone who had been doing a lot of work and was not done, but was taking a moment to verify that the world was still configured in a way that was survivable. He extended one hand toward Knox without letting go of his father with the other. Knox looked at that hand. He looked at the small fingers, the specific gesture of it, not asking to be held, not asking to be rescued, just asking for contact, for the simple empirical confirmation that the thing you need is within reach. He crossed the parking lot. He took Owen's hand. The boy's fingers closed around his, and Knox felt the specific weight of a 6-year-old's grip, small and complete and absolutely certain, and stood there in the Crestview afternoon with Grant's shoulder 6 inches from his own, and Owen's hand in his, and the sound of Willis's radio in the background, and the distant rumble of a Harley engine turning over somewhere on Granger Street, and he understood, with the specific clarity of a moment that doesn't announce itself, but arrives fully formed, that the thing he had been riding toward for 15 years was not a destination. It was this. It was right here. And 67 hours from now, Aaron Hendricks was going to file a federal motion, and Knox Mercer was going to be standing at the center of the largest fight of his life. Not with his fists, not with the road, but with documentation and legal filings, and a federal agent in Asheville, and a cooperation agreement being signed in an office he couldn't see. And the fight was going to determine whether everything he'd built, and everyone he'd chosen, and every mile of mountain road he'd claimed as his own would still be standing when the dust settled. He didn't know if they would. He knew that he wasn't going to let Owen Hale watch him walk away from it. He knew that Grant Hale was standing close enough to touch, and that 15 years of distance had collapsed in the specific way that distance collapses when the thing that created it turns out to have been a lie someone else told. He knew that Decker was on a highway to Asheville, making the hardest drive of his life. He knew that the mountain was still up there, the clubhouse still standing, the access road still intact for 67 more hours. He looked at Owen. "You okay?" he asked. Owen considered the question with his characteristic literalness. He looked at his father, he looked at Knox, he looked at Willis and the Gray Coats and Rooster and Mackey and the parking lot of the Crestview Family Services building on an afternoon in winter that smelled like exhaust and cold pavement, and the specific aftermath of a situation that had not yet resolved but had, for the moment, paused. "Yeah," Owen said. One word. Small and total. And Knox Mercer, who had been riding toward something for 15 years without knowing what it was, held a 6-year-old boy's hand in a parking lot in winter and felt the last clean edge of the wrong story give way, and what was underneath it was not the disaster he'd always half expected. It was just the truth, and the truth was enough to ride toward. But the fight was not over. 67 hours. And Aaron Hendricks, somewhere in Asheville in an office Knox had never seen, was already on the phone with his lawyers. And one of those lawyers, Knox was about to find out, had been waiting in Crestview all morning for a specific piece of information that would change the shape of every move Knox had planned. Because the thing about a man who'd been building toward something for 15 years was that he never built just one door into the room. He always built two. The second door Hendricks had built opened at 4:17 in the morning, 63 hours after the parking lot. It opened in the form of a filing, emergency injunction, federal court, Asheville Division, that landed on Britta Voss's desk at an hour designed to minimize the window for response. Knox got the call from the lawyer at 4:22. He was already awake, sitting at the table in the clubhouse with cold coffee and the specific exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 31 hours, but whose nervous system had not received the message that stopping was an option. The injunction was clean. Hendricks' legal team had built it carefully. It cited the cooperation agreement itself as evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy within the Iron Covenant, arguing that voluntary federal disclosure was an admission of organizational guilt rather than individual accountability. It was a perversion of the process so precise and so confident that for 30 seconds, Knox sat with his phone in his hand and felt, for the first time since the mountain road, the specific weight of a situation that might not resolve in the direction he needed. Then Voss called. "He overplayed it," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been awake as long as Knox and was running on the fuel of a person who had been waiting for exactly this move. The injunction cites the cooperation agreement. That means it acknowledges the agreement exists. The agreement, when combined with the recordings and the testimony of my contact, establishes that the cooperation was obtained under duress from an ongoing criminal operation. He just put his own fingerprints on the frame. A pause. "I filed the counter motion 40 minutes ago. The judge is reviewing both simultaneously at 7 a.m. I need you to understand something, Mr. Mercer. This is going to work, but it is going to be ugly for approximately 6 hours this morning, and I need you to let it be ugly without doing anything that gives Hendricks additional material." "Define additional material," Knox said. "Don't go anywhere near Asheville. Don't make contact with anyone in Hendricks's network. Let the ugly happen in the courtroom and stay on your mountain." He stayed on his mountain. The 6 hours were the longest of his life, longer than any firefight, longer than any mountain road in any blizzard. because this was the specific torture of a man built for action being required to be still while something that mattered was decided in a room he couldn't enter. He drank bad coffee, and he sat with Rooster and Patch and Mackie, and they talked about everything except what was happening in Asheville, which was the only honest way any of them knew how to be present in a situation they couldn't control. At 11:43, Voss called back. The injunction was denied. Hendrix's counterfiling had been entered as supplementary evidence in the federal investigation. The land acquisition had been halted pending review of the shell company documentation, which Patch had delivered to Voss's office the previous afternoon, with 3 specific chain of title irregularities flagged and annotated in the precise, unhurried way that Patch did everything. The access road remained with the county. The clubhouse remained where it had always been. Aaron Hendrix was in a federal building in Asheville being asked questions he had spent 15 years avoiding. Knox set his phone down on the table. He pressed both palms flat against the wood. He breathed out slowly through his nose, the full length of a breath that had been compressed for 67 hours. Rooster put a fresh cup of coffee in front of him without saying anything. That was enough. Decker came back 3 days later. He drove up the mountain in his truck in the early afternoon, parked in his usual spot, and sat in the cab for a few minutes before getting out. Knox watched from the window, not obviously, just present at the glass with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He watched Decker get out of the truck and stand in the cold mountain air and look at the clubhouse with the expression of a man verifying that a thing he wasn't sure he'd have anymore was still there. Knox went outside. They stood in the cold, 10 feet apart, with the mountain doing its winter thing around them. The specific silence of a landscape that didn't require anything from anyone. "How'd it go?" Knox asked. "It went," Decker said. "Your brother?" Something moved across Decker's face. "He's going to be okay." The case against him was as manufactured as Grant said. Voss's office is reviewing it. A beat. He's 22. He's got time to put it right. Knox nodded. Decker looked at the clubhouse door, back at Knox. "You gonna tell me whether I still have a place in there?" Knox looked at him. He looked at the man he'd ridden beside for 12 years, the man who'd sat watch over a frozen child through a blizzard night, the man who'd made a wrong decision under impossible pressure and then driven to Asheville alone at 3 in the afternoon to answer for it. "You were there last night," Knox said. "You just weren't here." Decker absorbed this. He understood what it meant, that the accounting had been done and the result was not erasure. That brotherhood was not a thing you lost through failure if the failure wasn't a betrayal of the thing itself. That the difference between those 2 categories was real, and Decker had stayed on the right side of it even when he'd been in the wrong. "Okay," Decker said. He walked to the door and went inside. Knox stayed outside a moment longer with his coffee and the mountain air and the sound of the other bikes under the overhang, the specific small sounds of machines at rest, cooling metal, wind catching chrome. His own Road King was still there, retrieved from mile marker 11 2 days ago by Mackie and Rooster, who had found it exactly where Knox had left it, snow-covered and patient, undamaged in the way of things built to last. He thought about Owen. Grant had called the previous evening from Crestview. Owen was home, not the home before the storm, not the home of bitter custody arrangements and loud fighting and a coat still on the hook while a child walked into the blizzard. Something was being built in the space the storm had cleared, something provisional and careful and real. The way things built by adults who have finally stopped lying to themselves tend to be real. Claire had agreed to a family counselor. Grant had agreed to a schedule that acknowledged his proximity was not the same as his presence. Owen had been asked what he needed and had given his answer with characteristic precision, quiet, and both his parents in the same room without it ending badly. They were working on it. The diner on Granger Street in Crestview opened at 6 in the morning and served coffee that was not good but was hot, and it had a corner booth with a view of the street that Knox had been occupying for 40 minutes, when Grant walked in at 6:42 on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the storm. Grant slid into the booth across from him. He looked like a man who had slept recently, which was an improvement over the last several versions of him Knox had encountered. He ordered coffee from the waitress with the ease of someone who came here often, which apparently he did. They sat for a moment with the specific comfort of two men who had relearned how to be in a room together and were still discovering the dimensions of it. "Owen asked about you," Grant said. "What did you tell him?" "That you'd probably come by when you were ready." Knox turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside on Granger Street, the morning was assembling itself. A truck making a delivery. A woman walking a dog. The ordinary machinery of a small-town Tuesday that had no idea what had happened on its edges 3 weeks ago. "Hendricks?" Knox asked. "Cooperating with Voss's office," Grant said. "The network is larger than she thought. It's going to take a while." He paused. "The land deal is dead. The access road recorded back to the county yesterday." Knox nodded. "I'm going to stay in Crestview," Grant said. "At least for now. Owen needs—" He stopped. Adjusted. "Owen needs me to be somewhere he can find me. That's new information for me, and I'm applying it." "Good," Knox said. Grant looked at him across the table. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to say the real thing. "I'm sorry," Grant said. "For the bar. For all of it." Knox held the look for a moment. He thought about the bar on Clement Street. He thought about 3 hours and 40 minutes, and a tab paid, and a decision made on a cold sidewalk. He thought about 15 years of a story that had shaped him, not only in the ways that hurt, but in the ways that had built the specific man who had stopped on a mountain road in a blizzard because something under the snow moved. That man had been built by all of it, including the absence, including the wrong story. He wasn't sure he'd trade him. "I know," Knox said. It was the same thing he'd said in the conference room. It meant the same thing and more now. It meant that the accounting was done and the result was not erasure, and that the years ahead were a different country from the years behind, and both of them were going to have to learn the geography of it as they went. Grant picked up his coffee. Knox picked up his. They sat in the corner booth of a diner on Granger Street while the Tuesday morning assembled itself outside the window, and the coffee was not good, but it was hot, and the world outside was cold in the ordinary way of winter rather than the extraordinary way of storms, and that was enough. It was more than enough. 3 weeks later, Knox rode the mountain road on a clear afternoon. Not through blizzard, not in crisis, not toward anything urgent, just riding, the way he'd ridden for 20 years before it had become freighted with the weight of arriving somewhere or leaving something. The Road King ran clean under him, the engine warm and steady, the specific sound of it bouncing off the rock faces on the switchbacks and coming back altered, the way sound returns from stone. He passed mile marker 11. He slowed, not to a stop, just to the pace of a man acknowledging a place without making theater of it. The guardrail was still there. The replacement section, structurally optimistic but holding. The snowbank where the boy had been was long gone, dissolved into the ordinary ground of February, leaving no evidence of the shape it had made or the shape that had been inside it. Knox thought about the weight of a child through a whiteout. He thought about a locket with a photograph inside it. He thought about a promise made at a car door in the snow. He rode on. The mountain opened up above him, the north face still white. The access road running clean and unobstructed toward the clubhouse where Rooster's bike was parked outside, and smoke was coming from the chimney, and the sound of something being argued about in a friendly way was probably already happening inside. Below him, Crestview was there in the valley, small and winter-lit, ordinary in the way of places that contain extraordinary things without knowing it. Somewhere in that ordinary town, a 6-year-old boy was in school, or drawing at a kitchen table, or asking a question that nobody expected, or sleeping in the specific total way of children who have decided they are safe enough to sleep. Knox didn't need to check. Knowing it was true was sufficient. He opened the throttle on the long straight above the final switchback and let the engine have its full voice, the sound of it rising into the cold mountain afternoon and dispersing into sky. And he rode the way he rode when there was nothing between him and the road but the road, cleanly, fully, without weight. The man who had paid a bar tab on Clement Street 15 years ago and walked out into the cold telling himself he was done was not on this bike. The man on this bike knew what he was riding toward. He always had. He just hadn't known the name for it until a frozen child had whispered, "Don't fight," into the firelit quiet of a mountain clubhouse, and the whole wrong story had finally, mercifully, come to its end. The engine ran on. The mountain held its ground, and somewhere behind him, in the particular silence of a country road in winter, the sound of a single Harley faded slowly into the distance, the way all true things do. Not disappearing, just becoming part of everything else, which is the only kind of permanence that was ever real.